Hey there, everyone, and welcome to our Wednesday night Bible class here at the Concord Road Church of Christ. I am absolutely thrilled that you are joining me for this Bible study. And if you are joining us for the first time, I am especially thrilled that you've chosen to tune in. I hope that you'll get something out of this study. I hope that you'll enjoy it, and I hope that you'll want to come back and be with us. Tune in anytime that you possibly can. It's hard to believe this is our last study together in the year 2020. Next time we see each other, Lord willing, it will be 2021. And with that, let me say Happy New Year to everyone out there. I hope that 2021 for each of you proves to be a happy, healthy, and prosperous new year. And with that said, let's turn our attention to the Word now. We're in the book of Numbers. And so if you've got your Old Testaments with you, that's where you want to be. When you get there, Numbers chapter 5 is where you want to turn. I know there's a possibility you might be thinking, wait a minute, didn't we just cover Numbers chapter 5 the last time we were together? And the answer is yes, we did. But you might remember that by the end of that class, I had a very, very, very brief period of time that I could make some application, like a minute, maybe 2 minutes. And that really doesn't do the application justice. And so we really ran out of time to make application. And so I really want to go back and make some application on chapter 5 before we move into chapter 6. And so with that in mind, let me remind you what chapter 5 is all about. Chapter 5 starts a new section in the book of Numbers. The children of Israel are at Mount Sinai. They've been given the law. They're about to move out toward the promised land. And as they're preparing to move out, God decides that there are certain laws that need some special emphasis. And so that's what we're going to get here in chapter 5. Some laws with some special emphasis. Now, the first laws that need some special emphasis are purity laws. It was really important, and this is in the first 10 verses of chapter 5. It was really important. Purity was so critical in the Old Covenant community. And what chapter 5 verses 1 through 10 does, it reminds us of what caused ritual impurity. And when a person would be ritually impure, they would be excluded from the community until they became pure and ritually cleansed again. And so those first 10 verses deal with purity. Well, as we get into verse 11, purity is still the matter of discussion, but this time it has to do with marital purity. And what we have beginning in verse 11 all the way through the end of the chapter, verse 31, is an adultery test. Now, the law already was very clear about the penalty for two people who clearly were guilty of adultery. In clear cases of adultery, both parties were to be executed. Adultery was a capital crime among the Old Covenant community of God. And so what we have in verses 11 through 31 then of chapter 5 is basically we have a supplement to that law. What happens if a husband suspects his wife of being unfaithful? What then? Well, this is what then. It allows a suspicious husband to initiate this ritual legal action against his wife. And as he did so, he would not be liable for punishment in the event that she was proven innocent. Now, I'm not going to go through the process again because in our last lesson, we went through the process and we discussed that at length. You can go back to our last lesson here on YouTube and you can check that out for yourself in case you are joining us for the first time. If you want to learn a little bit more about this adultery test. But one of the things that I will say is it really did provide some protection for women. You know, the Old Covenant community was in many ways like the rest of the ancient Near East. It was a very male-dominated culture and society. And in male-dominated societies in the ancient world, most women had very few legal protections, and they were often very vulnerable to all kinds of mistreatment. Well, this in a very real sense prevents that. It protects an innocent wife from being divorced or being maimed or even being killed by a vengeful husband just simply on the grounds of suspicion. That wasn't uncommon in the ancient Near East, but God makes sure in his community that women are protected from that kind of possible potential mistreatment. Some might say, yeah, but wasn't this just humiliating to a woman? Whether she was innocent or not, just having this ritual legal action initiated against her, wouldn't that be humiliating? And I think the answer would be probably so, I would think. But don't forget, I think it would also be humiliating and embarrassing to the husband. I think this would make him think twice before he would make some kind of charge about his wife. And so I think the nature of this really served as a deterrent for a man who just wants to try to find a reason to get rid of his wife. And so I think in a very real sense, it provided some protection. Now, again, not going to go through it all. You can go through that if you weren't with us a couple of weeks ago. But now let's make application. Like I said, this is what I really want to do before we move into chapter 6. What applies to us? Do we just read Numbers chapter 5 and go, wow, that's really interesting. Man, I can't believe that. Wow, look what they had to go through. And these purity tests, and man, this adultery tests. And well, that was pretty interesting. Let's move on. Now, I don't think we read it that way. I think there's principles there that are really, really, really relevant to us. And we need to pause for a minute and we need to ponder those principles. I think Numbers 5 really gives us quite a bit to think about. And I'm going to give you 3 things that I think are really important to keep in mind. One is the need for purity. As God was forming and establishing his community together, forming his community, I'm not surprised that the very first thing that he emphasized, the very first laws that he emphasized, had to deal with purity, whether it was the ritual impurity of the first 10 verses of chapter 5, whether it is moral purity that we find in verses 11 through 31. Purity was very, very important to God. Purity is still very, very, very important to God. Not only was it crucial for the Old Testament community, purity is very, very important for the New Covenant community as well. We need to be reminded that God's church really is a holy nation. His gathering of Old Testament Israel and forming them as a nation really was foreshadowing all these things that took place in the Old Testament. Many of you have heard me say this before. All these people and all of these events and all of these places and all of these laws, all were designed to point to what God was ultimately going to do. And so the Old Testament community of Israel actually foreshadowed the time when he would gather his ultimate community. His ultimate plan was to gather a community that was bigger than ethnic Israel. His ultimate plan was to gather a community that didn't have racial boundaries, ethnic boundaries, language boundaries, any boundaries. And that nation, that holy nation, would be called the church. And it would be established through the work of Jesus Christ. Well, as we get into the New Testament, we see how critical purity is for the church. I want you to turn over. Let's look at a couple of verses in the New Testament. So just hold your place there in Numbers 5. Just mark it. We'll be back. But let's go over to 1 Peter chapter 2. When you get to 1 Peter chapter 2, look down at about verse 9. Remember what I'm showing you here, what I'm emphasizing here, is that God's church, that we are a holy nation. That's how God designed us to be. 1 Peter chapter 2, look down at about verse 9. He says, as Peter writes to to believers, he says, "But you are a chosen race, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, a people for God's own possession, so that you may proclaim the excellencies of him who called you out of darkness into his marvelous light." The church is a holy nation. You know, sometimes I'm in conversation with people, and that conversation may turn to politics. It often does. Most of us have, if not an interest in it, we have a legitimate concern about it. And so oftentimes people will say things that reflect a kind of a thinking within them that we might, as Americans and as the United States of America, be something of a chosen nation. And we kind of think in terms of God ruling us, and we've betrayed God like Israel did. And we're moving away from God like Israel would do so often in her life. And as God punished Israel because Israel would at times, on a national level, rebel against him, well, God maybe is turning away from us because we on a national level are turning away from him. I don't think that is, the best application. In fact, I think that is misunderstanding some really important Bible themes and topics. Now, I'm not disparaging the unique place of the U.S. in world history, and that I really believe that God, through his providence, has used this nation for so much good. And I'm not diminishing that at all. I love my country. I wore the uniform, and, so I'm not disparaging that at all. But we need to understand that America was never in any way like Israel. Israel was selected by God for a special purpose. And they had a special role in the plan of redemption. And so there was a very special relationship between that nation and God. That nation literally was his covenant community. When we get to the New Testament, there is no political, geographical nation that belongs to God in that way. But there is still a nation. And that nation is the church. We are the nation. It doesn't have geographical boundaries, nor does it have, as I said, racial boundaries or ethnic boundaries or language boundaries or any kind of boundaries. It's open for everyone, but it's a spiritual kingdom, and we are a holy nation. And what God was foreshadowing through all of these purity laws in the Old Testament for Old Testament Israel, we see what he was talking about and what he was pointing to in his ultimate holy nation, the church. And that is the importance of purity. I want you to take a look at 1 Corinthians chapter 5. You're going to recognize this, 1 Corinthians chapter 5. So as the holy nation, this is the nation. The church is the nation. And I am concerned, very much so. Are you concerned that we as a nation are leaving behind God's will and are just presuming upon his grace? I sure am, but not in the sense of America's doing that, despite the fact that we clearly are moving away from any kind of religious commitments. But I'm concerned about the true holy nation moving away from God. And that is people who profess to belong to him and becoming more and more indifferent toward passionate, wholehearted commitment to obey him in whatever it is that he commands. I'm disturbed that more and more people who profess to be Christians, they live like the world, they look like the world, they party like the world, and they just seem to think that that's perfectly okay. So I'm concerned about the true nation of God moving away from him as their Lord. The New Testament makes it crystal clear that this holy nation called the church, God wants us to be pure. He demands purity. You'll see it in places like 1 Corinthians chapter 5. As I said, you'll recognize this. When Paul is writing to the church at Corinth and he rebukes them because they are tolerating a level of immorality that is unheard of even among Gentiles. And that is that there is some kind of sexual relationship between someone and his stepmother. Paul basically says here that when he says in verse 1, as such a kind that does not even exist among the Gentiles, that someone has his father's wife, he's saying even the Gentiles condemn incest. Even the Gentiles do that. And here you are. You are apparently, verse 2 says, you've become arrogant and not mourn instead. Apparently, they're really proud of just how much they can tolerate. That does sound a lot like us as a culture. We are proud of how much we can tolerate. The more perverted, the more proud we seem to be. And so, look what he says down here in verse 6. Paul says, first of all, in verse 5, I have decided to deliver such a one as Satan for the destruction of his flesh, so that his spirit may be saved in the day of the Lord Jesus. Your boasting, he says in verse 6, is not good. Do you not know that a little leaven leavens the whole lump? This kind of impurity will work its way through the body and will influence people to their detriment and destruction. Clean out, he says in verse 7, the old leaven, so that you may be a new lump, just as you are in fact unleavened. For Christ, our Passover, also has been sacrificed. Therefore, let us celebrate the feast not with old leaven, nor with the leaven of malice and wickedness, but with the unleavened bread of sincerity and truth. There is impurity among them, and Paul is demanding that they get rid of the impure. They are to be pure. They are to be pure. A couple of other places where you'll see this emphasized, and it's all through the New Testament, the importance of purity in the community. But just look over in 1 Timothy chapter 5 real quick. 1 Timothy chapter 5, verse 22. 1 Timothy chapter 5, verse 22. He says to Timothy, do not lay hands upon anyone too hastily. What he's talking about there is commissioning someone in leadership. Paul there's some problems with the eldership in the book of Ephesus, and Paul has sent Timothy as his representative to straighten those things out. Do not lay hands upon anyone too hastily and thereby share responsibility for the sins of others. Keep yourself free from sin. Again, the importance of purity. Keep yourself free from sin. Look at James chapter 1. James chapter 1. When you get to James chapter 1, look down at about verse 27. James chapter 1, look down at about verse 27. Pure and undefiled religion in the sight of our God and Father is this, to visit the orphans, that visit in the sense of help orphans and widows in their distress, and keep oneself unstained from the world. Keep oneself unstained. Purity. Purity is important to God. One more that I think of is 2 Peter. That pops into my mind as I was saying that is 2 Peter chapter 3, where Peter talks about the second coming and the cosmic holocaust that is going to be ushered in, the destruction of this present heavens and earth. And he says, we're looking for, according to his promise, verse 13, after that happens, for new heavens and a new earth in which righteousness dwells. And then he says in verse 14, therefore, beloved, Since you look for these things, be diligent to be found in him in peace, spotless and blameless. So again, the emphasis on purity, 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 the need for purity. That's what Numbers chapter 5, the first 10 verses are all about, the need for purity. God was setting the foundation for purity among the community. And as we then move over into the new covenant community, we see that emphasis on purity, reflecting the holiness of God. And if we are indifferent about purity, we are going to certainly stand accountable for that. So purity, it really causes us to think about, Numbers chapter 5 really causes us to think about purity. Another thing that Numbers chapter 5 really causes us to think about is the importance of marital fidelity. This is another thing that God not only emphasized among the Old Testament community, but boy, is it emphasized among his true holy nation, the church, as well. Turn over to Matthew chapter 5. You've seen these, Matthew chapter 5, but let's look at them again. It never hurts. Matthew chapter 5. One of the things that you're going to see here, verse 31, as Jesus is talking about what life in the kingdom is supposed to look like, it says in verse 31, it was said, whoever sends his wife away, let him give her a certificate of divorce. He says, but I say to you that everyone who divorces his wife, except for the reason of unchastity, he says, makes her commit adultery, and whoever marries a divorced woman commits adultery. And you have the emphasis, the only reason for a person to have a right to another spouse, except for naturally if that spouse passes away, is marital unfaithfulness, sexual betrayal. And so the emphasis here that the New Testament puts on marital fidelity, you'll see it again in Matthew chapter 19. Go over there real quickly, Matthew chapter 19. And the question was asked as Jesus is talking about divorce here. Some of the Pharisees question Jesus about it, and Jesus says, haven't you read from the very beginning there in verse 4 that God created a male and female? And he said, for this reason, you should leave your father and mother. You should be joined to your wife. You should be one flesh. And then he said in verse 5, what God has joined together, let no man separate. And they said, well, Moses allowed that. And he said, well, Moses permitted it. God ultimately permitted it. Moses was his spokesman. Because of the hardness of your heart, he says, but from the very beginning, he says, that was not that way. And I say to you, he's talking to his new covenant community here, I say to you, whoever divorces his wife except for immorality and marries another woman commits adultery. Marital faithfulness, it is so critically important. Turn to 1 Corinthians chapter 6. Take a look at what Paul says here, 1 Corinthians chapter 6. Sexual sin is just, it's different. Someone asked me the other day, isn't sin sin? Well, yeah. All sin is rebellion. All sin is violating God's law. All sin makes us a lawbreaker and makes us accountable. Every sin, the penalty for every sin is separation from God. Yes, in a sense, absolutely, sin is sin. But in another sense, not every sin is exactly alike. All sin separates us from God. Any sin separates us from God. But not every sin is exactly alike. And we see that in places like 1 Corinthians chapter 6. Where he says, as he's talking about the importance, some people there in Corinth have bought into the idea that God doesn't care anything about the body, and so since God doesn't care about the body, I can do anything that I want. I can go visit prostitutes. I can be as sexually impure as I want to be. God doesn't care because that's just the flesh doing that. The spirit, in my spirit, me and God are still good. And Paul is saying that's absolutely absurd. He says the body is, just look at the last part of verse 13. Yet the body is not for immorality, but for the Lord, and the Lord is for the body. For these folks who are saying that God doesn't care anything about the body, Paul says, yes, he cares very much about the body. And he will raise up the body. And look what he says in verse 15. Do you not know that your bodies are members of Christ? Shall I then take away the members of Christ and make them members of a prostitute? May it never be. Or do you not know that the one who joins himself to a prostitute is one body with her? For he says the two shall become one flesh. But the one who joins himself to the Lord is one spirit with him. Flee immorality. Again, purity is so important. Flee immorality. And specifically, he's talking here about sexual immorality. Every other sin that a man commits is outside the body. But the immoral man sins against his own body. Do you not know that your body is a temple of the Holy Spirit who is in you, whom you have from God, and that you are not your own? And then in verse 20 he says, therefore glorify God in your body. Every other sin is committed outside the body. But sexual sin, it's different. And that's why it is the only sin that allows one spouse to put away another and take another spouse. This one sin of sexual immorality. So, as we read Numbers chapter 5 and we see this adultery test, we see again the emphasis that God is putting on marital fidelity. So, the need for purity is emphasized in Numbers chapter 5. We do well to think on that a lot. The need for marital fidelity is emphasized. We do well to keep that in mind. And the third thing that I want us to be reminded of, that this helps us, Numbers chapter 5 really causes us to think about, is the whole concept of suspicion. So God allows the suspicious husband in Numbers chapter 5, beginning in verse 11, he allows the suspicious husband to initiate this ritual legal action if he suspects his wife has been unfaithful. And then God demonstrates, God's involved in this process, and so God will make it clear whether there's real guilt or not. But it reminds me that when we get over into the New Covenant community, we don't have these kind of ritual legal actions to initiate. That's not a part of the New Covenant community in anything. But what we know about in the New Covenant community as far as suspicion goes is that suspicion is always insufficient for action. Suspicion is always insufficient for action. The benefit of the doubt must be given. You're going to see that in a couple of places. Look, for instance, in 1 Timothy chapter 5. Turn over to 1 Timothy chapter 5. 1 Timothy chapter 5, when you get there, look down about verse 19. Again, I told you that what's happening in 1 Timothy is that Paul is sending Timothy as his representative to Ephesus to deal with the problem of leadership and to make sure that godly leaders are in charge. That's why what you have in 1 Timothy chapter 5, or for the book of 1 Timothy, of course, is qualifications listed for elders and deacons. But you get to verse 19, and look what Paul says in 1 Timothy chapter 5, verse 19. Do not receive an accusation against an elder except on the basis of 2 or 3 witnesses. Unsubstantiated accusations are to be rejected. They are not to even be investigated. They are to be ignored. Timothy is not to listen to gossip about leaders. There has to be multiple responsible people making this charge before it can be listened to. Now, again, this isn't meant to put leaders beyond successful accusation. It's meant to put them beyond illegitimate suspicion and accusation. Well, it's the same thing as you watch the process of discipline in the church. You see the same thing. There has to be substantiated behavior. Suspicion is insufficient. There are always people who are eager to falsely accuse. We live in a world where people are eager to falsely accuse. And listen, that's not just unique to our world. That's unique to the human condition since Genesis chapter 3. And we've got to be very careful and think about this. And so, Numbers chapter 5, is a lot of good stuff that we're prompted to think about. The importance of purity. God has always required purity for His people. Don't buy any suggestion that you can be impure and still in covenant relationship with God. Second of all, the importance of marital fidelity. God is serious about marriage, and we better be serious about marriage as well. And the third thing is, suspicion is insufficient to act against a person. We need to always give people the benefit of the doubt, where the only thing is suspicion. Well, that takes care of this class. Now, what we're doing, you say, well, that's only about 30 minutes. If you joined us on Sunday, I said, since we are moving to this online virtual format, our classes are going to run about 30 minutes. I think it's probably in terms of length, this format here is 30 minutes is more conducive. And so, we're going to keep it right around the 30-minute mark. Sometimes I might get long-winded and go over a minute or two, or even maybe under a minute or two, but we're going to keep it around then. So next time we're together, next Wednesday, we're going to take a look at chapter 6. We're going to look at some really interesting things there about the Nazirite laws. And then we're going to make some applications. We always want to make some relevant application. We don't just want to study this for curiosity's sake. We want to study this for our spiritual benefit. That's why it's there. And so I hope you'll join us next week as we continue our study of the book of Numbers, Numbers chapter 6. In the meantime, again, I hope everybody has a very happy New Year. Lord willing, I'll see you Sunday. Take care and God bless.